This video covers how to do trend plots and 95% confidence intervals for those trends by groups over time. And this can be done from the 95% CI tab. So from the 95% confidence interval tab, scroll down towards the bottom. Under the section that reads as performance of groups over time, select your outcome. Here we'll use inpatient beds utilization. Select your factor. We're going to type in state and select it. We're going to compare our 50 states. And now select a time variable. Type in month. Also, you can just drop down and go down to month, but it's towards the bottom, so you have both options here. You have them in all of these in this entire section. And since we have a lot of different options to look at, we're just going to go ahead and select the defaults. We have a continuous variable as the outcome, so we'll leave a mean t-distribution confidence interval there. And everything else looks good. We'll just take a look at it now. So it went ahead and did those values. I'm using spline knots, which is a nonlinear function. It smooths out some of those up and down lines that we're used to, that can look just a little bit hard to get a good read on what the trend is. I'll switch it to those up and down lines. This one's not so bad. There's not a lot of variation. So for this, you can use trend line. You can use a straight trend line, which are just straight lines between each of the 2 points. So we'll go back to, if you click on no under the question of use straight trend lines, then what you're left with are the smooth curves. So let's go back to the top to some of our earlier options. So in step number 4, we're using time increments of 1 month. So the data is coming out as in monthly values. What we were looking at earlier is those same monthly values, but if we wanted to look at, instead of 1 month periods, we wanted to look at 3 month periods, type in 3 there, and we can scroll down. And so by doing 3 month increments with more of that data, that helps to smooth out some of that variation, or those up and down numbers that are hard to look at. So let's look at the straight trend lines to see if there's some improvement. There's a little bit of improvement. We still have some variation here, but that's just the nature of this bed utilization, and this represents January of 2020. Okay, so let's go back to 1 month increments. We'll skip number 5 for right now. We'll leave number 6 and 7 as their presets. And for number 9, you'll notice that there are about 50 colors there, and that's because it automatically grabs the first 50 colors out of your various options. We'll decrease this line width. Scroll down. So the lines are a little bit harder to see, but for each line, but it's a little bit easier to look at overall. Let's go back to the curves. Answer no there. And we have what are called other lines. and those are time point lines as well as target lines. We'll leave this as is for right now. And for the number of spline knots, if we increase that, we add curvature. So our default value is 3. Now we're going to increase it to about 4. That'll add a little bit more curve to it, and that might actually help us see some distinctions between the different states. Add the overall group line under 13. The overall group line would be, in this case, the average across the U.S. Instead of breaking it up into 50 states, we're going to get that value for all states combined. So let's switch that to yes. Actually, we're going to switch it to a line with a band, and that confidence band it's a 95% confidence band that gives us that range. So things that have a trend above and below that overall line would suggest that state's behaving differently than the rest of the country, or the country's average as a whole. So add a target line. We'll add it at 0.7. The inpatient bed utilization is similar to what we looked at in the Describe tab when we had that one density plot that changed for each month of the year. We used a target of 0.7 there. This graph and that other graph in the Describe tab work well together. They show you some of the same ideas but with different perspectives. Add a time point line. So we're going to add it at 3, which represents March of 2020. And we'll add it at 13, which represents January 2021. So let's take a look at it now. Okay, so we can see how things began to look different around the period of when COVID started. And then we're going to look at what happened about January 2021. We had the vaccine. We had time for different organizations in different states to react differently to COVID. So this is an important period to take into account. The black lines, the black vertical lines, might be a little bit tricky to see with these different lines, and I do have a black line for that overall line. So let's change those. We'll change the overall line and the time point lines as well. And the target line is black, so we may leave that the same color, but let's change the others. So for the overall color, we use cyan. Let's try tomato. That's a little too close to the others, so let's go back to cyan. Okay, for the target line, red usually stands out well. We may change that later, but let's change the time point lines, those vertical lines. We'll change that to orange. That's a little easier to look at, but let's go back and change the other line, the other line's width under step 11. Let's just increase that to 7. Okay. So it's a little easier to see our targets, our time points, and the overall value. So let's see what else. Let's try it again with the straight trend lines. kind of gives us the same look. It's a little bit, looks a little smoother on the, when we use those spline knots or the nonlinear curves. Go back to the curves. And so similar to 12-month rolling averages or looking at values by the quarter, the smooth trend lines help us to get a better read on the data. They react less to high variation in monthly periods. And when we're looking at process improvement, we often see the greatest amount of variation at the beginning of the stage and as things change. So over this last part of 2021, we're seeing things become a little bit more stable. So there's less change there. So in the beginning, we saw a lot of variation, and we saw that variation decrease as over time, but we also saw that inpatient bed utilization increase. So you can see which states are above that critical value in the red dash target. And as when things go back to normal and inpatient bed utilization goes down, we'll start to see it happen in different states at different rates. And so we'll see more variation later on. But for now, we can see the difference between when COVID started in this first orange line versus January 2021. Okay, we can also modify the X and Y axis. Say if we want to just kind of zoom in a little bit, we can increase those two values. And this might help if you want to see your labels. But another thing you can do is modify your label line size. You can make it bigger, but that might be too hard to read, so let's go down. You'll notice that each label matches the color associated with that line. But we can also zoom in on the y-axis. This value really only goes to a value of 1, so let's go to 1.1. And for the minimum value, we'll go to 0.1. So when we want to compare these different states, we can see which ones are statistically different from the overall national average. But maybe we're just interested in certain states. So we can go back up and highlight specific groups. In this case, we're going to look at our four states with the most cases and deaths. That's California, Florida, New York, and Texas. So we'll go back down to the plot, and we can see that now we're looking at 4 different states. And the other states we've removed from that view because these are our primary interest. Again, we can change the y-axis so we can get a better look. So we're going to have it go down to about 0.35 and up to 0.9. And we're going to add confidence bands. And so our confidence bands in this case allows us to compare each state with their counterpart. In the prior graph, we were looking at what states were different from the national average, but in this case, we might want to see how states compare. So if the overall line is too much to look at, if we may only need just the line, not the confidence band, we can go up to the overall confidence band. So we're going to change line with band to just line. And so now that line, we can tell when a state's different than the national average, but we can also see when each state differs from each other. And you can see that, oh, yellow's a little bit hard to read who that is. I'm pretty sure it's Florida, but let's change yellow. So we're going to go all the way up to the top and remove yellow. See if it's easier to see the state. Yeah, that was Florida. So Florida is now green because we have only 4 states to look at. We're going to increase the label size. Okay, now we can read each state a little easier and fit this graph a little bit more nicely. So this is how to do performance of groups over time. And this can be done in the 95% CI tab. And you can also find for each state, for each month, you can get the point estimate, which is the mean, and you can get the lower and upper 95% confidence intervals. If you want to change that 95% to 90 or 99, you can come do that over here. We'll change it to 99 and we'll see it changes the graph as well as these values down here. But for each month, for each state, we can get all those values here as well as the overall values, which would be the national average. And this can be done in the 95% CI tab. And this is how you do it.